My name is Ruffin Rhodes.
My name is Naniela Ogbodo.
My name is Stanley Evans II.
My name is Kelly Addison.
I am Black.
I am a professional.
And I'm an architect.
And it all matters.
Thank you for joining us this evening on another episode of Inside Voices, Black Thoughts, IVBT. Inside Voices, Black Thoughts is a series of discussions held virtual to reach a larger audience base. It is here that we share and discuss the matters affecting our profession from a perspective not often heard, the Black perspective. On this forum, we discuss thoughts about how to improve ourselves and the profession. Due to the small number of voices that are sometimes not represented around the table, addressing issues on a wide range of topics, IVT hopes to give a voice expressing the thoughts from a Black professional's perspective. Having said that, we are not the voice of all Black people. The views expressed here are views based on our experiences. We want it to be a free and not restricted conversation. This evening, our topic is gentrification, recall and recognize. Gentrification, tonight we want to put a red line through gentrification and replace it with community revitalization. This topic is so important that we will not be able to cover it all tonight, and we will have a part 2. And in our next discussion, we will discuss how we repurpose and revitalize gentrification. I'd like to remind our panelists and audience about the sensitive nature of these conversations. So let's keep this conversation respectful. We should also understand that our views are not uniform. They differ, and to move the conversation, we will ask that we all show each other a little latitude for mistakes and the misunderstanding. We all mean well. I'd like to acknowledge and thank the various organizations that have collaborated to make IVBT what it has become. BAM Orlando for initiating the IVBT idea, NOMA Orlando, South Florida NOMA, BAM Miami, AIA Orlando, and the Orlando Foundation for Architecture, and finally, AIA Miami for hosting these episodes. These professional organizations mentioned have realized this issue of equity, diversity, and inclusion is an issue to be attacked from all angles. And working together is one way of bringing attention to the fact that it is more diverse, that is a more diverse and inclusive profession. We will result in a better society. So let's talk about this root word of gentrification. It's gentry. Gentry speaks to a well-born or well-bred people, high society, the class between nobility and the upper ruling class, aristocracy, people who have a coat of arms and own large tracts of land, especially those consider themselves as class of any kind. But what is gentrification? It's a process in which a poor area of a city experiences an influx of middle class or wealthy people who renovate, rebuild homes and businesses, and often results in increased property values, but the displacement of those who were there is present. An not urban, but a British-born urban sociologist, Ruth Glass, first used gentrification in a sense to describe the influx of the middle-class people displacing lower-class residents and urban residents. It denotes the transformation of the poor neighborhoods and cities by the process of middle and upper class, upper income groups buying properties in these neighborhoods and upgrading them. Gentrification, what does it look like? Well, here's an example. What it means for the rich is you have bright, shiny new places to go, homes, shops, restaurants, and things to do in your neighborhood. But for the poor, it means that businesses are closing. Working class people are displaced, commuting costs cost more, and they feel like they've been treated as second-class citizens. In a country already divided first by race and then by the economic class, who are the American gentry? Well, our first steps tonight are realizing what gentrification is and recognizing the signs of gentrification. Some great examples of revitalization exist throughout our country, and we will make note of 18th and Vine Street in Kansas City, Missouri. This was a $70 million investment in a commercial area that is anchored by a jazz museum and the Negro Leagues baseball museum. Another local example is Paramore Village, which was transformed into Paramore Oaks. This was an older, dilapidated apartment complex that was removed and replaced with a bright, shiny new apartment complex with income restricted apartments so that persons who formerly lived in Paramore Village could move into Paramore Oaks. Another example right here in Orlando is the West Lakes redevelopment, where you had some apartment buildings that were in poor shape, were removed and replaced with a new apartment complex, again, with low income and mixed market rate apartments. And they even threw in a daycare to make it more palatable for the members of the community who formerly lived in the apartments that existed beforehand. Again, those persons were displaced, but they came back. So gentrification often destroys traditional neighborhoods of color. As architects, we seek to do the highest and best use while following the direction of our clients or developers. But who actually defines highest and best use? And what if that use of our client's vision causes displacement? We want to practice our values and defend our communities. And so we need to be able to distinguish between gentrification and urban revitalization. Our panelists tonight are people from a very, very good group, and we're going to name them. My name is Tim Johnson. I'm serving as a co-moderator, and along with me will be assisting me will be Crystal Jenkins, co-moderating.
Thank you, Tim. I'm glad to be here.
Great, thank you, Crystal. Crystal will help us with the questions. Our first panelist is Ms. Camille Lewis, who's the Executive Director of the Hannibal Square Community Land Trust. Camille, welcome.
Hi, Tim. Thank you all for having me.
Great to have you, Camille. Our next panelist is Mr. Bob Cambrick, President of the Cambrick Group. He's a former Director of Policy and Planning at the South Florida Regional Planning Council. Bob, welcome aboard.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Good to have you, Bob. Our next person is Mr. Carlton Ely. Carlton is the Regional Equity Initiative Manager for the Miami Valley Regional Planning Commission. Carlton, welcome aboard.
Good evening, Tim, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this courageous conversation.
Great, thank you. And lastly is Mr. Evan Woodson, an African-American studies instructor who grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, currently working with LSU and the Macbeth Academy. And Evan is going to be teaching in the Dominican Republic in the fall. Welcome, Evan.
Thank you, Tim. Good evening, everyone. I am blessed and highly favored. Glad to be here.
Great. Well, with that, I'm going to ask Crystal to take it away and begin asking our panelists the questions.
Thank you, Tim. So tonight, I have a list of questions, and I'm sure you guys are eager to talk to us about gentrification. So the first question is, how do you define gentrification, And what definition do you have for this word? Camille, let's start with you.
Sure, Crystal. For me, I guess I describe gentrification as that really, for me, it's something that's happening to the community, not with the community. So, you know, there's usually some group that comes in from outside. They are saying that they want to revitalize the area, but they're not really discussing with the community what the community actually wants. And it's not really revitalizing in a way that the community can profit from it. So it's happening to the community, not with the community.
Okay, very well. So thank you for that. What about you, Carlton? What do you have to say about that issue of gentrification?
Thank you for asking. One of the things I think I should acknowledge is I used to be a public servant working at the federal level. So when I worked for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, I was actually responsible for adding the definition of gentrification to EPA's website. So the definition for gentrification that I use, and it is featured on their website, is a process of neighborhood change that results in places of lower real estate value being transformed into places of higher real estate value. And that may sound value neutral, but obviously if you start to peel the layers of the onion back, you start to understand that clearly there are going to be ripple effects in that process.
Absolutely. The lower from the higher. It sounds dividing to me. So what about you, Evan? What do you have to say about that?
Well, so I think we've gotten two pretty good definitions. And as an educator, I always try to lay out for my students the difference between definition and connotation. There's the reality, the stone cold definition of what something is, but then there's also the connotation of a word. For me, the connotation of gentrification is just displacement. And it's important. I'm gonna try to contribute a lot of history to our conversation here. I'm the resident non-architect in this conversation. But gentrification does not happen in all communities. It doesn't necessarily happen in poor white communities, which do exist, and I don't think we talk about that enough. The history of gentrification is very tied up in the history of segregation in our country. So whether we're talking about redlining or 15 minutes south of where I'm sitting right now, where the Black Wall Street, Greenwood community existed for a long time, or Chicago or Overtown, Miami, it's always tied up in segregation. So me as a historian, I always define it as going hand to hand with that history of segregation that we have in our country.
Yeah. I think it kind of go hand in hand. So thank you for that. I really appreciate that. So what about you, Bob? Last but not least.
Well, the great thing is that I could just say ditto, but no, part of it, because great responses from everyone. But the component for me that I think is also valuable to look at is the role of public policy in guiding, fomenting gentrification. And so it's not only, as Camille said, when things are happening to the community instead of with the community, or as Carlton said, changing lower property values into higher property values, but it also is applying public policy, whether it's through comprehensive planning, the zoning, community redevelopment areas, the sudden investment in terms of law enforcement, beautification, that's done through public policy. And those constructs are often put forward under the idea of revitalization, but because it's not being done with the community, as Camille had talked about, then the outcome is the community gets transformed and a new set of people are now living in this traditional, usually African-American, lower income community. Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. And it sounds a little unfair, just a little bit, but I mean, ultimately, gentrification has good points and bad points, and hopefully we can pull back a few layers and talk a little bit more about that. Anybody else have anything they want to chime in on? I hear you wanting to say something to us, Carlton.
Well, we took the time in the introduction to reference the root of the word, which was gentry, but we shouldn't forget the stem of the word, which is shun. And the word shun means process. And so, when we want to make nuanced distinctions, we have to understand that gentrification, isn't necessarily an action. It's actually a process. It's more of a process than it is an action. And so that's the issue that we're dealing with, is how we have processes that do occur. And when they actually happen, we have ripple effects. And so the question then becomes, how do we make sure that we allow processes to occur where we manage those impacts?
Yeah.
Things in a way that is far more progressive than what we're currently doing.
Mm-hmm. But that means we need to participate, right? I mean, ultimately, everybody needs to be able to know what's going on. You can't just put yourself under a shell and say, I'm just going to do my thing. It's something where everybody has to be involved, in those processes, I would say, right?
Well, they need to be involved in the processes, Crystal, but you have to know about the process.
Right.
And what you also have to know is how and when to participate. And I think that's one of the fundamental things that winds up happening to these communities, that in the regular day-to-day business of government, whether it's at the local government, city, county, regional, state, or federal level, that machinery is moving forward in terms of public policy. That entire system is set up with the idea that everything's going to be done after public notice. But public notice is at the back end of the process. So all these public policy debates are going on. And then when we have something that we're ready to do, now it's time to notify the community. And that notice is, we've been doing the same notice process since 1922 in the planning process. With the U.S. Department of Commerce came out with model guidelines for zoning in 22, and I think it was 26 for comp planning, but that it was all built on, well, once you have something ready, tell the public and then present it to them. Well, at that point, the decisions for the most part have been made. There's a lot of investment that's been made into getting to that point. So what we have to deal with is involving communities, teaching them what is your community? What do you want from your community? How and when do you get involved when things are potentially getting ready to happen? And that's a process that really has to be grassroots driven. There's not a lot of funding. There's some funding out there. Carlton, has worked in that area where you have government programs that are trying to do better. But for the most part, that's got to come from the grassroots. It's got to be community-based organizations. It's got to be activists. There needs to be citizen academies where we're training and educating people about these processes and having them ready to stand up and deal with it when it happens.
Yeah, so that brings me to the next question. What are some of the warning signs that our community can look for to be susceptible when it's coming to gentrification? And anybody can answer. What are the signs that we need to look for in those communities, or in the communities in general?
Well, I'll start off. I worked in the public sector, at least at the federal level, for about 20 years. So when I offer my response, it's based on observations from that span of time. To be a little, facetious, when Richard Florida comes to your town is susceptible to gentrification. But to be serious, as we indicated, this is a process. I think some of the subtle ways in which, communities become susceptible is like when the real estate community starts to label your community as being up and coming. there are subtle things that actually occur, whether it be through the real estate community or through the press, in which they start to label communities differently in order to assign value to places where value may have been taken from a generation earlier. So clearly, we know that during eras of segregation and during eras of redlining, the mainstream press used to take value away from places because many mainstream newspapers used to characterize Black communities in a certain way. That's the reason why we have Black newspapers, is because of the fact that African Americans wanted press that would reflect their communities in a positive light. But what we often are finding now is that places that have become distressed or have experienced prolonged disinvestment is that we often find professionals or practitioners who normally would characterize communities in a negative way, all of a sudden start characterizing communities in a positive way. And yet no change has occurred in terms of development. It's just the label has changed. This place is now up and coming. It sends a message to the market and people start to realize, oh, this is where I probably should direct my attention and my energy if I want to get a return on my investment or get a return for making as little investment as possible. Some of the things I would point to.
Okay, thank you, Carlton, for that. I appreciate that. But Bob, I wanted to, when you mentioned 1920 and the process back in 1920, that process hasn't changed, am I correct?
Well, I mean, there have been, overall, no, to a large degree. One of the things, especially when we start talking in the arena of land development, which can be very litigious, what winds up happening is you create models and then people adopt those models. They withstand legal challenges and you don't stray from that to a large degree. And so when I was talking about the public notice process, that was stemming from model codes regarding zoning and land use. And, in the comp planning part, there's a footnote that kind of said, well, you need to have, more than 2 hearings and you should try to maximize participation. But at the same time, it still was saying, just put an ad in the newspaper, and the term is newspaper of general circulation. And even that as a process is still being used, despite the fact that people don't buy and read newspapers anymore. And so the ability for the public to a large degree to be involved is kind of diminished. And one of the things to try to look at is that there are other things that wind up happening, that you're talking about an indicator. For me, one of the indicators that has been going on since California first did it in 1945, which is the community redevelopment process. And that entire process is where we codified the concept of slum and blight. And what that boiled down to was saying, hey, first go and look at an area in your community that's suffering from slum and blight. And those terms, for the most part, are kind of nebulous in a way, because the lack of adequate parking is an indicator of slum and blight. But at the same time, it also says, well, there are different things that go into it. So lack of adequate parking, lack of investment, lack of affordable housing. And so you go in and you do these studies and you do a finding of necessity. So we've gone to this community and we said, hey, you are facing slum and blight conditions. So now what we're going to do is we're going to create a plan to fix it. And so there's, for me, a large correlation throughout the country. Like I said, it started in California in 45. Florida and other states have replicated that Community Redevelopment Act process. Even take into account that California, I think it was in 2018, walked away from it. It wasn't working. Florida has tried to walk away from it, but there's a lot of money on the table.
Mhm.
What's wind up happening is that tax increment financing has provided dollars for redevelopment.
Mhm.
Those dollars are matched with implementation projects, but when you look at the community redevelopment plan, if the community wasn't at the table in the beginning,
Mhm.
the outcomes that they're shooting for will not represent that community in the future. That community will be transformed and erased.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Bob. Thank you. So, Camille, I wanted to get you to chime in a little bit, and specifically, are there challenges that you have seen in area of development that as far as gentrification?
I think one of the big issues, and I'm coming from an affordable housing standpoint, I think one of the big issues that we run into is that there is a desire, there is more reward to try to, again, as you guys are talking about as architects, the highest and best use, to try to build and develop what is going to get you the most bang for your buck. And so that may not necessarily be what is, and it usually isn't what is benefiting the community that's existing, the historical community. But it's always nice to say, okay, we're building luxury homes or luxury apartments. And so you put that there and you give the gentry, the other people, an opportunity to come in, and this is going to be based upon what's been there before or where they've been before. This is going to be a lot better for them financially, but it's not necessarily better for the community. So I think that the biggest issue there, a lot of times, is that developers are trying to build the most luxurious, the most expensive, the most whatever for the community, whether it is commercial or housing. And that's not necessarily what needs to happen in a community. You can revitalize without pushing out or changing the character of the neighborhood. So I think that that's the thing that I think is the most disturbing. And I think that if there's an opportunity, I think that there's not usually given the opportunity for the community to speak about what they actually want. There are, in every neighborhood, we want to have nice restaurants to go eat. We want to have nice places to go and entertain. We want to have something to do with our family. We want to have all of that. But does it necessarily need to be the highest end so that the community that is existing cannot profit from it?
Right. And that's always a challenge.
So when Camille was talking about this balance or imbalance between luxury and affordability, my mind instantly went to Miami, Florida. I spent 5 years in Miami, Florida. I think it's a policy problem you see across the entire city. But to go back and answer your original question, Crystal, about the signs of gentrification at the ground level, like, again, I'm the non-architect, so I'm going to try to speak more in layman's terms. Two things I think of that I've seen. Number one, when somebody from a different racial or class identification moves into your neighborhood and then seeks to change the way public space is being used in that neighborhood, that's a pretty good sign of gentrification. So I can give you an example, two examples. Last year I lived in New Orleans, and I lived in the Tremaine neighborhood, which is immediately behind the French Quarter. It's the oldest African-American free neighborhood in the United States. And gentrification has been happening rapidly there since Hurricane Katrina 2005. And the battles that many Black residents, longtime residents of Tremaine fight, of course, it's all these housing complications and cost of living, but it's also just, can we have a second line parade, which Black folks have been doing in New Orleans for hundreds of years. And, when wealthier white folks move in the neighborhood and start calling the police because there's somebody outside with a trombone at 10 p.m. on Saturday night, when that's been going on in that neighborhood for, since George Washington was alive, that's a sign. I think in Miami, because we lean so heavily into luxury at the expense of affordability. You have Wynwood, which is like globally one of the most important art districts, I think, in the world. Art Basel goes to Wynwood every year. But then you have folks right on Northwest 20th Street that are calling the police because the Uncle Luke music is too loud, the Two Live Crew, they don't like to hear Miami bass. Well, you did move in, right across the street from 20th Ave. So a lot of it is kosher.
Or playing cards in the, or playing cards in the community park or dominoes in the community park, right?
Exactly, right. And you see these battles playing out in Washington Heights, in New York City, which is historically over the past 56 years is a very Dominican neighborhood. It's the way that people weaponize the police, and it's the way that people try to change the way that public spaces are used and the culture that happens in those public spaces. That's, to me, a pretty early sign. As an educator, I also see it in schools. A quick example I can give you from Miami, when you see a historically African-American public school in an old historically Black neighborhood like Booker T. Washington High School in Overtown, when you see that school drop down to maybe 40% or 50% capacity, and rather than sending their children to that school, you have white, middle to upper class, upwardly mobile folks who are essentially gentrifiers who would say, no, we'd rather pay the taxes or foot the bill to build a new private school or to build a new charter school that is a quarter mile from Booker T. Washington to avoid sending their kids to school with African-American kids and Latino kids. That's another sign of gentrification. And maybe that's a little bit down the road, but I've seen that with my own eyes, the way that it affects school districts and the funding for schools as well.
So I guess that's the grassroots that we need to kind of look at and of course identify. I think all of that definitely makes sense. Thanks everybody for comment on that. I wanted to kind of dig in a little bit deeper, and I have quite a few other questions, but the next question is, what do you think the overall impact is with gentrification? And what would you say to well-meaning gentrifiers who do not understand their impacts? So, this is a full question. And so I would actually want to start with Carlton, because he has a lot in his face. I can tell this expression.
Well, I mean, in terms of what's the overall impact? I mean, I'm inclined to say is a problem of opportunity hoarding. Charles Tilley was a sociologist who spoke about this issue in the 1990s. I mean, so what we have is a problem where populations that are currently affluent are getting more of what they really don't need. And populations that are less well off are still struggling. And so, in the end, I mean, when we look at this issue of gentrification, is there's a problem of a toxic inequality that we are fueling. And it's important to think about ways in which we can disrupt that process. And disruption isn't a negative word, because if we only allow the current dynamic to persist, is going to lead to an outcome that's not sustainable. And toxic inequality is not sustainable. I mean, so we shouldn't be allowing the market to basically continue to deliver an outcome where the benefits only accrue to one segment of the population at the expense of the other.
Amen.
The pandemic laid bare the severity of the opportunity gap within many cities and towns across the country. The segment of the population that was the most vulnerable to the pandemic, that died immediately when the pandemic reached our shores, were the segments of the population that were poor. But why are people poor? Because of trends of opportunity hoarding that go back decades. Even the creation of suburbia was a process of opportunity hoarding, because when the suburbs were created, African Americans couldn't apply for the GI Bill. They weren't allowed to have access to those type of benefits. I mean, because of racist based policies. So towards your second question, which is, what do you say to a well-meaning gentrifier? I think one, it's important to acknowledge that once you strip away the emotion and once you strip away the rhetoric that can occur in these type of discussions, what you're left with, at least one of the things that you're left with, is the problem of market failure. And market failure is a basic economic principle that basically suggests that in a process, let's say production, externalities are being created. Also in that process of production, there may be benefits that are being created. So as you suggested earlier, there are positive and there are negative sides to this. But in terms of those externalities, we need to be mindful of the fact that there are monetized costs and there are non-monetized costs. And there are some segments of the population that are bearing the burden of those externalities. And those externalities need to be mitigated. So if someone wants to come to me as a well-meaning person to say, this is great, like, how are you understanding, anticipating, and mitigating those negative effects because those burdens aren't going to go away. And if we don't intervene to correct them, they're only going to get worse. So when we talk about issues of climate change is an externality. It's a sign of market failure. Do you like secondhand smoke? So if someone else is smoking and you get cancer because of it, well, that's an externality. And so there are clear externalities associated with the process of gentrification as well. And all we're saying is that as a nation, we should hold responsible parties to either, clean up how they do things so that they address and mitigate those externalities, or either the government needs to intervene. And that's normally what happens under the economic principle of market.
Very well. Thank you, Carlton. Bob, you were smiling. I kind of saw you in the background a little bit. Did you have anything you want to add to what Carlton was talking about?
Well, when I was smiling, I was remembering that term, well-meaning gentrifier. And I was trying to figure out in my head how not to respond the way I wanted to.
Well, that's thank you for being on.
Is there such thing as a benevolent mass murderer? So I don't know how to redefine that properly. But for me, the impact of gentrification, and I'm struggling my head very quickly. There we go. Very quickly. The band Living Color, not the show, the band Living Color, one of the greatest rock and roll acts of all time, had a song on the same album, Cult of Personality, but it was called Open Letter to a Landlord. And it starts off with Corey Glover, that fabulous tenor of his, singing, "You can tear a building down, but you can't erase the memory. These houses may look old now, but they have a value that you can't see." So that's what gentrification is doing. It's saying that what your community is doesn't matter. And what we want it to be does matter. And what happens is it becomes the loss of those homes that may look older. It's the loss of the people who live in those homes. It's the loss of the cultural, religious, societal aspects of that community that slowly just get picked off a little bit at a time. And I remember having a conversation with a very well-meaning person who's active in the affordable housing arena in Florida for decades. And the person said, well, shouldn't Black people in a gentrified community be happy because they're making money? There's, that the market is buying them out. And so should they be happy and move on? And I was like, well, there's part of it where you should have individual choice. If you want to move and sell, yes. But there's the other part. They're the people who don't own their homes that are going to be displaced. If you look, historically, home ownership rates in African-American lower income communities are very low. So those are the people that are most susceptible to being displaced. The rents that they've been paying are less than market rate, and it's what they can afford. But now all of a sudden, either we're going to go up on your rent, or we're just going to, basically tear down the structure and build something else. So where do you go now? And so there's no process in the place for how to help those people. It's not a government action that displaced them, so there's not going to be any assistance. It's just all of a sudden you're gone, and you got to figure out what are the other options that are available. So the impact is greater than just simply the transformation. And a person who is wanting to move into a community, I go back to, the things that Evan was saying, don't try to change the community from what it is. That community has survived. If you want to live there, then live there because you want to be part of what that community is. And excuse me, one other thing I was thinking of is like in Winter Park, I remember going to a city council meeting, and it was once again a developer had bought a parcel in the single family neighborhood. And what they were trying to do was they were going to, they want to change the land use to commercial or multifamily. And they were arguing that, well, we're in proximity to areas that have already been changed. So we're going to be a transition zone. Well, you know, if you use that argument, the transition zone is that everything is, it's just a domino effect.
Transition.
One of the comments I made at that time was, buying land is not authorization to make money. If you buy a piece of property, you buy it and you know what the legal requirements are for what can and cannot be developed. And if you can't make a profit off of that, then don't buy it and don't come into that community.
I agree. But I mean, some people actually want to abide by the law and some people want to push their limits.
Yes.
So Camille, I'm sure you've had this kind of situation happen to you.
Yeah, I really was tickled when Bob said that, because I wasn't sure what a well-meaning gentrifier is either. I wasn't sure how to answer that part, but I think that the overall, it just doesn't sound like well-meaning gentrifier, but anyway. I think the overall impact of gentrification, I think, is just, it's continued, it breeds resentment, it's continued disenfranchisement. And then there's also many times disdain for the people who have come in and with the people who have come in to gentrify the neighborhood. So you've got a situation where, you know, whatever were the social and economic divides before are magnified in a community when gentrifiers move in. Because now you have folks who feel like, hey, you know, I'm just here coming to live, and they haven't thought about what was built, and they didn't build it, but somebody else built it for them. What has that done to this community? So they're not coming in, as Bob said before, and actually wanting to be a part of the community. You're trying to create something else because now you want to co-opt this area and really colonize it, make it into what you want it to be. And then you want folks to be happy about it. And so it just kind of, it is a microcosm of what happens in American society and other societies as well, overall, in that you continue to feed the situation where there is the us and the thems, the haves and the have-nots, because the people in the process beforehand, whether it's local government working with developers, whether it's just developers coming in after they get the words blight and slum and they can get land for pennies on the dollar, whatever that is, you're now coming in and you are deciding that what you want to do is better than what was there. And you're disrespecting the people who live there, which breeds more, again, resentment. And I think, unfortunately, it ends up making a lot of folks who are in these neighborhoods where this is happening feel like, well, it doesn't matter what I say anyway, it doesn't matter what I do anyway. And it continues that process of not even participating, not making the noise to say this is not okay.
Yeah, I agree. You either are asking for permission or you're asking for forgiveness.
Right.
Which one are you asking for? You know, that's my voice. I mean, I agree with what you're saying.
And they're not asking for permission.
Nor forgiveness.
I agree.
Yeah,
I'm not asking you for anything.
Well, I keep trying to think about specific examples of this, and when you ask about the impact of gentrification, it's all of these things that Bob and Carlton and Camille have mentioned. It's a loss of culture, it's animosity. But if I could put my history hat down and put on my sociology hat and think about urban planning and think about cities, one of the biggest challenges I think that cities are going to face in the next 50, 100 years is urban sprawl, aside from or tied in with the issue of climate change and can we continue to commute an hour to work every day. I wonder if gentrification isn't a part of that process. The way I see it is every city I go to, the suburbs of the 1950s were the hoods of the 1990s, right? Like it's just a never ending cycle of white flight beginning in 1950s. Carlton mentioned the GI Bill, which kind of set this whole process in motion. White families being able to move further and further and further out. I just wonder if there's a limit to that. Somebody is commenting right now and talking about climate gentrification. The biggest conversation in Miami right now related to climate gentrification is the future of the Little Haiti neighborhood, which 70, 80 years ago was called Lemon City. It was a mostly white or maybe Jewish neighborhood. As we've talked about before, Haitian American immigrants, Haitians and Haitian Americans have made that community their home. And it just so happens now that that sits on high ground. And as Miami, and again, just yesterday morning, that building collapsed on Miami Beach. There are questions about its proximity to the water, and did that have to do with its, like, we are already in the era of climate change gentrification. It's not a future thing. You can see it happening. Rents and values of properties have skyrocketed in Little Haiti as the focus of gentrification in Miami has shifted from Wynwood and Overtown up, literally right up US 1, right up I-95 up to Little Haiti. So the long-term impact of it is not just for Black and Latino communities that are actually being pushed out. I think there's a bigger picture of what do our cities look like, and there's a bigger picture related to urban sprawl that I think gentrification has to be a center of the conversation that we have about urban sprawl and the sustainability of our cities.
I agree. I totally agree.
And I was going to say, Evan, on that point, it goes back to, once again, the public policy process. One of my grad school professors, or my planning theory class, talked about the concept of planning in the coin of the public interest. And I said, well, define that. And he said, I don't have to. All I have to do is convince 3 out of 5 commissioners that what I'm saying is in the public interest. So I just simply need to market. So whatever the policy is going to be, but one of the great ones is, what about the children? Who's gonna vote to not plan for our children? And that's what the conversation around climate change in a way is happening, and climate gentrification. When I reached out to a couple of professors that I know and talked with them and said, tell me who's looking into this. And I told them the background. I said, when I was at the South Florida Regional Planning Council, I sat on both the Broward County Climate Change Action Task Force, as well as its the one in Miami-Dade County. And it was mind-boggling to hear all of the things that the different members of the committee wanted to do in terms of changing public practice, development standards because of climate change and the urgency in Southeast Florida. And I remember just one time I said, what does this do to not just minorities, but what does this do to the average person? What you're basically trying to create is you're trying to push everyone away from the coast, if you can, reclaim those areas along the ridge of Florida, and the ridge really is Overtown, Opelika.
I-95 was built right along that high ground.
Right, that the high ground of Florida are the minority cities in Miami-Dade County going up, and when but their thing was, well, that's not what we want to do, but it's what we need to do in order to survive. And so that's the continual conversation that we're faced with. And that's part of what we need to be looking at, is that conversation is going to happen regardless. Doing something in the coin of public interest is going to happen regardless. What needs to happen in a better way is our communities being at the table as part of the conversation of what is a public interest, and that we are a public interest.
Right. I agree. I totally agree. We have to make sure that we are at the table at the beginning. And I think, a lot of this, of course, is stemmed, people who are in architecture or actually, assigned projects, once they get involved, sometimes they feel like they're too late in the process. And so I'm sure a lot of listeners here are wanting to kind of know, taking on projects of color for communities of colors, how can they be more proactive in that capacity? What could they do? I mean, to kind of get more involved in early stages of the process. I'm sure it's kind of challenging to, I'm sure, Carlton, you might have some idea to this.
Well, in terms of getting involved in the process early, one way you can do it is by leading a technical assistance exercise in a place where the market hasn't changed yet. I'm an urban planner by training, but I led a technical assistance project in Gary, Indiana, which is a community that is distressed. It was in 2006. So at that time, Gary had many similarities to Detroit as a city. In 2006, obviously, Detroit has some changes in recent years. But the point was to get in early is to see where the opportunities are and to pull together people of like mind to help residents in such places to articulate what is it that they want to see in terms of their communities. Because if they don't have the opportunity to articulate it, we know that once the machine starts running, people are going to frame the narrative in the way in which they feel comfortable. So for us, or at least for the project that I worked on, it required, one, being willing to do something pro bono, but two, actually being bold enough to do a technical assistance exercise that was going to be oriented around the objective of advancing goals of equity, being responsive to the needs of the population that is there in the community, the population that bore the disproportionate burden, and helping or ensuring that those residents frame in very clear terms, what is it that they desire as residents? Because in the end, that is going to be the instrument that they have to, use in speaking with responsible parties. They're going to ask, what's your vision? What's your plan? Well, we translated a variety of different concerns and positions and arguments into something that would be cogent from the perspective of someone who is working for a local government. And so I felt that was the responsibility of planners and architects and community developers, was to translate those aspirations into an actual document that would be clear and cogent to the local government and to other responsible parties.
Understood. That's pretty. And how long was that process? Just curious, for you to be that particular location and do that. What's that time frame for pro bono work?
Well, for that particular example, I think it was consistent with whatever is normally the time that one would invest into, say, a charrette process or community advisory service process. So our time on the ground was limited to, a certain number of days. But if you don't know, in terms of the charrette process, the charrette is 3 steps. There's the prep work, there's the actual exercise, and then there's the process of writing up the recommendations and the book. So we built a relationship with the local community, with the local steering committee over the span of 4 to 5 months. And we had to listen clearly to what is it that residents feel is a priority. And then we had the exercise, which was like 2.5 days. And then the rest of that process was spent writing up the recommendations, giving them an opportunity to review the draft versions of the report so that it would be consistent with the things that they wanted to see. And then we gave them the final product. So that process overall, if you do it efficiently, could take like 6 months. But again, it's going to require the prep time. You have to invest the time there. There's the process, which is only a limited number of days, and then you have to write up the recommendations. So
very good. Thank you, Carlton, for that. So Camille, have you guys done any charrettes in the community or planning workshops?
Yeah, we did that with, we've got a project in pre-development now in an area that we haven't been before. We are typically in Hannibal Square, but we're in pre-development for a project in Orlando near Camping World Stadium. So we had a series of community meetings. We had charrettes, we got design ideas. We modified some of the things that we thought would be good for the community once they said, well, that's nice, but we'd rather have this. I think that the design that we came up with is something that is based upon everything that they said they needed, plus the RFP that we submitted for had the city had already had meetings with the community and said what they wanted. So we touched on every single point of what the community said they wanted when we submitted for the RFP, and then we went through the charrette process to make sure that we were giving the people who came to the meetings exactly what they wanted. I think what is tricky though, I mean, we are the developer in this case, and we're a nonprofit, but what is tricky, I think though, for architects is that your client has to have the desire to do that. And so maybe there's a way that architects can encourage their clients to have that desire, or maybe there's a way that the community can make sure that the local government where this development is going to take place will see the need of the community and require the owner to have that desire. Because it's one thing to have these conversations, but if the owner is just thinking about making the dollar and is not really concerned about that, I'm not sure how we get there unless it's either A, the architect can convince their client, or B, the community basically forces local government to force the client.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So right now it sounds like they're listening to the community, and everybody, you know, you being the developer, you guys listen to the community, and things are kind of moving along in the right way.
Yeah, I think if the developer has the desire to listen to the community, it's going to happen, because that's what they want. They want to come in and be a part, not come in and take over. But I don't know that especially for-profit developers have that desire. Mm-hmm. So that's where the tension is.
Absolutely, I agree. So Evan, did you have anything you would like to add?
No, not on this particular topic. I have some ideas for, our last 15 minutes and some more successful examples that we can reference, but okay. I'm good for right now.
Okay, very well, very well. So I'm sure we already kind of, another question that was asked was, where do the people being displaced go when gentrification takes place, and where should they go? And I think we kind of covered it. Ultimately, we want all of them to go back in the community that they came from. Ultimately, that's the strong desire. But
but when gentrification takes place, that's not what happens. Typically when gentrification takes place, nobody knows where they go, and that's not correct. Really high on the list of concerns.
Yeah, nobody really knows. That's the one thing that's behind the black wall of some sort, and nobody even really discusses that, which I think is very disenchanting.
Right, and nope, and it's both in terms of individuals, but also families. Unfortunately, one of the tools that is often used for a non-well-meaning gentrifier is partition. And what that is that's another thing that we have to work with longer term with our communities, is the fact that we have generational property in some cases, but no one has taken, no one had the knowledge or implemented that knowledge that when grandmother passed away, well, it became heir property because there were 3 or 4 right. kids that grandmother had. So now all of them own the property equally, but it never went through probate, and the non-well-meaning gentrifier picks off the one that's in need, whether it's a person that is having some problems financially, or problems created by some societal ills. If I go to you and all of a sudden say, tell you what, here's $5,000-$10,000 for your interest in your property. Right. Okay, once I've done that, now I go to the other 3 family members and say, buy me out. And that family doesn't have the cash, nor do they have a banking relationship. They can't buy them out. And on their partitioning, what winds up happening is it goes to court, and now they no longer own the property. It's now been bought by a third party, and now is on the market to be flipped. And so the issue, I mean, there are a lot of things along the way that we need to be dealing with to try to help with these issues. When you mentioned what could architects do, that's more difficult. As Camille mentioned, if you have a well-intentioned, well-meaning client that works well, it's very difficult. There's so few percentage-wise in all actual numbers of Black architects. And not only are you not necessarily have your own firm, but you're working in someone else's firm. And you don't get to always say, well, I'm not doing that job because it's gentrification. Well, I'll tell you what, you don't have to do that job, but you no longer have a job. And so the difficult thing is that professionally, you're going to be in a difficult position. You can try to get the client to come up with a better plan that works within the community framework. But what you can also do, as Carlton said, you've got to volunteer. You've got to take your technical skills. I can have, and I was fortunate over the years. I've worked with Andrew Chen from FAMU, and I go in and I do the facilitation. I help the community express what they want. And then the relationship I've had with Andrew and FAMU School of Architecture is that they then produce and say to the community, we heard what you said, does it look like this? Is that the outcome you want? And so that's the role that you as architects can play in helping communities express their voice, but realize the vision, as Carlton was saying. What does that actually look like?
Very well. Well, thank you for that. Yeah, thank you so much. We have a few more questions, and I think we're going to try to wrap up around 8:15 and take questions from the people who are listening to us. And so one other question I have is, I guess, we already answered that one, is what is the end result for gentrified neighborhoods? Well, I'm sure and everybody has their own thought process on that. So I'm gonna start with Camille this time. Because you're a developer, what is the end result for gentrified neighborhoods?
I think that the character is lost. That's the end result. The character is lost, the neighborhood is lost. It's something totally different than what it was. The community is lost. So plain and simple, that's the end result.
Okay, understood. What about Carlton? What are your thoughts on that?
Would you ask me? Or?
I said yes. What is your thoughts on that? What is the end result for gentrified neighborhoods?
I think that's an interesting question because when you have gentrification that is unbridled and unfettered, there are actually two waves that occur. And the first wave affects people of color, it affects low-income based populations. And then that second wave that occurs actually affects persons who are more affluent who are in the middle class. So, what is the end result of gentrification is the fact that it affects segments of the population at different times. And eventually, you have some persons who are probably more resilient, whose shoes eventually get tight. And then, when they experience the pressure of gentrification occurring, what they opt to do is they move out, but they move out because they choose to. And they end up going to places like North Carolina, or they go to places like Iowa, which is what has been happening in places like New York City. Persons who can no longer afford to live in New York City because of the fact that it's too expensive, because they're in the middle class, they're now going to the Midwest, or they're going to places like North Carolina. So it's an interesting question in terms of what actually happens. I mean, obviously, what happens is that the community that's left behind is a lot more upscale and a lot less affordable, the lower end of the economic spectrum, but even for people who are in the middle class, it's not affordable. There have been some writers who have talked about the trend of blue lining as opposed to red lining within communities, whereby we have clearly specific geographic spaces that have just become so expensive that they're above the price point of even people who are comfortably in the middle class in many of these places. So,
Evan, did you want to chime in? Thank you so much for that, Carlton.
I mean, it's, kind of the same thing as I said before. I think the end result on a grand scale is urban sprawl. And it's a lack of sustainable layout for our cities. Kind of to Carlton's point, maybe it's just a more extreme, class-based stratification of society. You usually get to a point where even the gentrifiers, the people, and that's exactly what happened in Miami. The first wave of people to move into Wynwood, the artists got priced out in like 5 years, right? So it's like, our focus here is definitely on Black communities and minority communities and how we're affected by gentrification. But I think in order for this conversation to really reach people's ears, unfortunately, people need to see how it's going to affect them and people who look like them and live in their neighborhoods. So there are a lot of really negative, unsustainable outcomes for everyone who lives in cities that's below a certain ridiculous price point, as Carlton was speaking to.
Okay, thank you so much, Evan. Thank you. So one last question before we take questions from the audience, and it states, what are some ways communities can starve off gentrification, stave off gentrification? How have communities been able to develop their neighborhoods without changing the character of them? So let's start with Bob on this one. What do you think?
Quick things, once again, regardless of whether the pressure is already there, but overall, we need to make sure that we're volunteering, working with communities of color, and just making them aware of things that that should help them survive and thrive as a community. And that includes just simply early on access to programs that will help with deferred maintenance of homes, access to how to help people build businesses, and the businesses can be community facing or greater than the community. Helping people to be able to invest in their community. That means becoming homeowners. That means being able to become, like I said, entrepreneurs that are now hiring other people. So how do you begin to change the word community to be a little more enriching for the residents of that area, and being able to deal with that before it happens?
Absolutely. Sounds like a pretty good plan. It sounds like it starts with you. And then after you do it, then other things will follow. But it starts with each person themselves, right? Carlton, what are your views on this?
One of the examples you showed at the beginning was the 18th and Vine Jazz District in Kansas City, Missouri. Based on my knowledge of that project, there are two things that they did in order to control gentrification. First, that project was conceived with the goal of balancing economic development and cultural development. So they wanted to encourage cultural preservation of the remaining assets that were within that African-American community, which were pertinent to jazz and to the legacy of the Negro Leagues as a baseball enterprise. So one, preservation, heritage preservation, was one of the things that served as a foundation just for saving what was there. And that's important because they set very clear expectations that preservation isn't just about classical architecture. The placemaking dividend of this community is rooted in the fabric of there being an African-American population that was here, that was thriving, that offered artistic expression and baseball as a way for persons to basically enjoy themselves, and there was a sense of place here. So the second thing that they did, and they were intentional in this, was the fact that they intervened to control the pace of the development. Mm-hmm. And as I indicated earlier about the issue of market failure, there comes a point where government has to intervene. And the parties who were the drivers of the redevelopment within the 18th and Vine Jazz District understood what they had. They understood that, yeah, if we let the market solve it, then it's going to occur at a much more rapid pace. And so they deliberately, intentionally were careful to control the pace of the development so that persons who were there would be more economically resilient.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So resilience is key and process is key. Interesting. Camille, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, one of the things that we don't talk about that much, and Bob kind of touched on it a little bit, is that, the beginnings of gentrification typically start in neighborhoods where there are a lot of absentee owners. absentee landlords, absentee owners, and Bob mentioned about where there's air properties where several siblings own one property and they don't really know what to do with it. I think that we need to, if we promote more home ownership, owner-occupied properties, you get less gentrification. Because if you have a situation where, and you can see when you see a neighborhood start to have more properties that are kind of going into decline and they're being rented out because no one knows what to do with the house or whatever. If you have more people living the homes that they're in the neighborhood, it's less likely that developers can kind of swoop in and start taking over. It's less likely that the local council is going to go along with the program and the developer says, hey, I got an idea. If they're more, so I think that we need to try to see if there's a way, and I don't know how to do that, but if we can see if there's a way that the residents of the community can start maybe taking hold of their own properties or the properties that are there and find a way to redevelop the properties themselves or get assistance to redevelop the properties themselves, and move into the properties instead of having absentee landlords. Or if someone is renting, you give them an opportunity. And I know that there are people who don't necessarily want to do that. Give them an opportunity to rent to own. I know it's difficult when it's 4 or 5 siblings and they own a property and they think that they're each sharing the $900 rent or whatever, but maybe there's a better opportunity to just go ahead and sell the property or provide an opportunity for somebody who actually wants to live in the neighborhood. Gentrification happens when there's less home ownership in the neighborhood. That's basically it.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Home ownership has a value in a number of different ways, and one way is by living in it, right? Yeah. So I agree. Evan, I wanted you to chime in on this particular question. It says, can the establishment of community planning boards be a tool for ensuring neighborhood participation on the process?
So I mean, I think there is a limit to there's a limit to the degree to which these planning boards can be successful if what we've been talking about, the home ownership and the general economic empowerment and like interconnectedness is not there. Every adult in the United States should have a vote, but the reality is that our communities often work in a way where dollars count more than votes. So if you have a community that is very politically active, but in which only 10% of people in the neighborhood own their homes, at some point you wonder which the vote or the ownership, the economic control is more valuable. And I think I can give us an example that is, again, historical. It's geographically closest to home to where I'm sitting right now, and that's Tulsa, Oklahoma. This wasn't the time in the 1920s. This was before desegregation and integration in the highways. But part of the reason why there was so much animosity among white Tulsans for the Black Tulsa community is because it was an economically empowered community. There was no method that white Tulsans could go through to like take over Black land without literally burning it and dropping bombs from airplanes. I mean, there was no avenue because of segregation was so economically interconnected, and there were higher rates of home ownership. You had, of course, doctors living next to people that were in a much worse off situation economically. Not everybody in Greenwood and the north side of Tulsa was rich, but the walls of segregation kind of unintentionally created a very strong economic community that was not brought down by gentrification. It was brought down by violence, right? So I think that Tulsa can teach us a lot as we come on the end of this month is the 100th anniversary of the race massacre. And there's just been a multitude of people that have swept into town, and they're trying to tell the story of Tulsa and Black economic empowerment. And I don't think it's a magic bullet, but I think that these things we're talking about, home ownership, political engagement, I think that they have to happen in order for gentrification to be staved off, if not stopped entirely.
Very good. Thank you for that. Thank you. Another question that came in, it says, homeownership or lack of thereof in Black communities is a result of redlining. I'm not sure. I mean, anybody?
I can chime in that very quickly. Partially, like it does have to do with the GI Bill that Carlton mentioned earlier. We know that homes are passed down generationally. Wealth is passed down generationally. But we also know that housing segregation and housing bias didn't magically end in 1964 when President Johnson signed that bill, right? It didn't end when Dr. King was marching. It's realities that just trickle down. You know, the white flight and the disinvestment we saw from Black communities, even after Dr. King's passing in the 70s, ongoing effects of living right under an interstate highway make things really, really difficult for Black and Latino folks in these urban central neighborhoods. So it is, I think, partially results of redlining, but there are things outside of and after redlining on our timeline that I think create a situation where it's hard to own your home as an African American.
Absolutely. But
And I think there are two things we need to understand about redlining. I mean, the first is redlining was a fiscal policy. So financial institutions basically took the position that, well, we're going to manage risk because we're not going to offer, loans or finance to neighborhoods based on the clear, obvious factor of race. Black neighborhoods were viewed as being more risky. And so if no one's lending to you, then your ability to acquire property is significantly reduced. And especially given the fact that some of the policies around buying requires putting down a down payment. Well, white people were allowed to put down payments. Black people often had basically put down 50% or pay more, which basically makes the process of being able to buy a home cost prohibitive. And so I think that's the subtle thing that we need to be mindful of about redlining. The second thing, which I'll say briefly, is that we say redlining to the point that it's almost lost its meaning. Redlining, in effect, was a domestic economic sanction. So, I mean, redlining as a policy was a weapon against minority and low-income based communities. And so when you weaponize a public policy, then one of the obvious implications of that is that it's going to affect, simple things like the ability to get a home. And so I think that's the greater legacy of what redlining means in terms of the implications of it, is the fact that we actually applied a sanction, economic sanction, within the borders of our own country.
Wow.
And I think that you said it, Carlton, but you didn't quite say it. It started with the federal government.
Yeah, kind of, sort of.
Yeah, not kind of, sort of. It actually did. They provided incentives for the banks and for builders to trying to get out of the Great Recession to provide housing for certain people and not people living within the red line. And so it started with the federal government, with what is now FHA.
Yeah, the GI Bill was federal money, federal home loans, federal money. Federal tax money went to white veterans of World War II. Go start a business, go get a college education. Here's a home loan. That was all federal.
Well, Carlton can't say that, so we can say that, but Carlton can't say that. So let's keep that now.
Maybe a price to pay, but I can say it.
So I know this has been time extremely well spent. I've enjoyed listening to you all, and I'm sure everybody that's listening on the air has enjoyed it as well. Do anybody have any closing remarks at this time?
I'd like to say, we were talking earlier about what are the symptoms that a neighborhood may be at risk of gentrification, and what I was reminded of is how often panels will be organized and the persons on the panel don't look like us. I think that's one of the obvious signs that a neighborhood is at risk, is when other people are controlling the narrative. So the point is that thank you for setting up this panel where we can have a frank conversation and say things and create our own narrative about this issue and why it's important and why we need to take it seriously.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for being here, Colton. Thank you. Bob, what about you?
It's through things like this panel and the people that are participating where we can begin to see change. And I'm going to throw something on Carlton, but Carlton, great resource. And I'm sure that Carlton will respond to emails that will say, here's another example. What we have to do is we've got to look at those examples of things that have worked well or have the possibility of working well, and figure out what are the learnable, teachable aspects of that, and then bring that back to our communities. Not every public policy is nefarious. Not
Right.
every implementation is systematic racism, overt systematic racism in a way. I think it oftentimes is benign in the sense of the implicit bias is I don't think about you, so therefore I'm not doing anything to you. But the outcome is it still has been done. And so there are examples. I mean, I had talked about earlier about community redevelopment areas. But there are opportunities. Like there's a really interesting thing that the city of Tallahassee is doing with their community redevelopment area for the Bond neighborhood. The Bond neighborhood is predominantly African American, lower income neighborhood. It is approximate to FAMU, and as a pilot project, they've taken $7 million of CRA funds and said to the community, create a citizen-based board and decide what are your priorities. And then use this $7 million in seed money that can be matched with other things and other partners to fix the community in the way that you want. And so we've got to learn about these examples. Hopefully, my understanding, they're going to replicate that now for Frenchtown in Tallahassee, the oldest African-American neighborhood in Tallahassee. They're going to replicate that there as well. And so we've got to learn from these things. We have to look at non-traditional ways, like for instance, Evan. I've enjoyed listening to Evan. And Evan keeps going, oh, I'm not an architect. Sometimes we don't need to hear from each other. I'm not an architect either. I'm a planner, as like Carlton. But sometimes we need to hear from those other voices that can inform and guide the conversation. So broaden the conversation to include people that are down for the cause, for lack of a better way of putting it, that are down for the cause, and then drive it home, make it happen.
That's what I'm talking about. Awesome. Very good. Very good. Camille, do you have any closing remarks?
I believe that we have to find a way to engage the community more, the neighborhoods, the people who are being impacted by this. We have to find a way to engage them because, the old saying is the squeaky wheel gets the oil. And things happen in your neighborhood because people feel like you're not paying attention. Not only do they feel you don't matter, but they feel like you're not paying attention and you can't do anything anyway. But I have seen situations where the residents come together and show up at the city council meeting in mass numbers and one by one take 3-4 hours in a commission meeting expressing their concerns. And then the vote doesn't happen. So we've got to find ways to get the community engaged so that they can come out and say, my voice does matter, and this is not what I want you to do with my neighborhood. And then after you've had that big show at the commission meeting, then you say, please sit down with us. This is what we would like to see happen. If you're going to be making policy, or if you're going to be providing funds, this is what we'd like to see happen.
Excellent, for sure. Thank you for that. What about you, Evan? Any final words?
No, I don't have too much more to add. Bob, I'm glad to be here. Like I said, as a non-architect, I enjoy being the oddball in the room. So you're welcome.
Odd is always the best.
You're not the oddball, Evan. There's a bunch of non-architects.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And so, I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. We are going to extend this. It is so much meat on the bones that we can't do one session and get all it in. So, but everybody needs to come back and join us for the next session, which I'm going to turn over to Tim, and he's going to let us know a few more details about that.
Thank you, Crystal. This has been a very, very great session tonight. We have enjoyed all of our panelists and really appreciate all of the questions that are coming in through the chat. Very, very good. Like I said at the very beginning, though, this topic is so broad, there's no way we could cover it all in one session like tonight. So I'm going to ask everyone who's listening to tune in on July 23rd at 7 p.m. We will have a continuation of gentrification. We're going to look at the next step, which is revitalizing and moving from gentrification to revitalization. I think it's going to be a great session. Look for the calendar updates, the flyers, and any kind of social media that we might put out to let everybody know that it's coming. Let me also say to my panelists, my friends, my brothers, my sister, thank you for being on tonight. Crystal, thank you for doing the questions night. Great job. Bob, Evan, Camille, Carlton, you guys are fantastic. And I think our audience has really enjoyed you. I know I have really enjoyed you sitting here listening. You guys brought a lot of relevance to this conversation on gentrification. Again, it's a large topic, and you guys have helped us to understand how to recognize and realize when gentrification is about to happen and where it's coming from. I really appreciated the solutions-based discussion you guys were having about doing some community engagement. We had a session previously on community engagement, but here we're talking specifically about gentrification and how being involved in your community and doing these community sessions helps to prevent gentrification. And I think those two are tied together. And then, Bob, I don't know if you've been doing your research here, but we had a session called All In, brother. And you talked about it, and I saw Crystal throw up her fist, man. So that was right on, man, right on. But thank you for all of the hard work that all of you all do every day, each and every day, what you've done in the past and what you're going to be doing in the future. Again, I want to thank our sponsors and those groups that are working with us to help us to provide these panel discussions. I want to thank our planning committee who's sitting on the sideline now, enjoying themselves, just looking at the fruits of this hard fought battle to get to this point. And our fearless leader, Mr. Jones, a young man who we're all kind of rallying around to make it happen. So thank you. But this field of architecture, and we as Black architects have been made better by this discussion. And so we're going to take what you've said tonight and make it actionable as we move forward. So thank you. And to all of our panelists, all of our visitors on Facebook Live and on Zoom, thank you again for joining us. We look forward to seeing you on July 23rd at 7 p.m. You'll see more about that one. We're going to announce the panelists soon, and we're going to get this thing moving. Okay? Thank you so much. This has been Inside Voices, Black Thoughts. This is season 3 and session 2. Session 3 is coming. So thank you again.